Freeze the signing! Get me legal, now!
She already knows. Hello, one.
All right, let's, telling charm, not tune Christians. You look like you didn't sleep. Big morning. Might be your last one running point on the details. Once this closes, you'll finally get to just be the vision person. Let the rest of us handle the machine.
Composed, unreadable. She had first read those words nearly a month earlier, standing in a crowded hallway on her way into a meeting that no longer mattered the way it once had. This morning, waiting for the elevator, she had opened the message once more and read it again, the way a person checks a wound to make sure it's still there, before letting her face settle back into the calm the cameras expected. She took her seat. She said good morning. She did not mention the message. Near the head of the table, Daniel Whitaker was already laughing at something an investor had said, his tie perfectly knotted, his hand resting easy on a folder of documents he'd helped rewrite in private for 6 weeks. Nothing about his relaxed shoulders or his easy smile suggested a man who had spent that time on calls Victoria was never copied on, aligning board votes she never saw coming, choosing the exact clause that would move her voting power out of her own hands the moment ink hit paper. He had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous plans are the ones delivered with a smile. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said to her, lightly, refilling his water. "Big morning. Might be your last one running point on the details. Once this closes, you'll finally get to just be the vision person. Let the rest of us handle the machine." A few people around the table laughed. It was the kind of comment built to sound like a compliment. Near the far end, a junior board liaison leaned forward. "Actually, if we're finalizing today, shouldn't the amended governance section go back to—" "We're past that stage," Daniel cut in, not unkindly, already moving on. The liaison sat back. Nobody else picked up the thread. In 3 years, Victoria had watched this happen more times than she could count. A real concern, raised in good faith, dissolved by someone else's certainty before it could land. She made a quiet note to remember his name. For half a second, her eyes went to the small framed photo, still sitting on the credenza behind the head chair. Her and 4 employees crowded around a folding table in a rented office, the day the company got its first real client. Nobody else at this table had been there. Nobody else remembered what the company had cost her before it made her famous. She let herself have the half-second. Then she looked away. Under the table, she typed one line into her phone and sent it to Marcus Reed, the lawyer she trusted more than almost anyone left in her life, sitting 2 floors down with the folder she'd asked him to prepare the night before. "Send it when I nod, not before." Marcus wrote back instantly. "Ready, 10 minutes. That was the gap between now and the moment Daniel Whitaker expected to watch her sign away a company she'd built from nothing. Victoria intended to use every one of them. Across the table, Daniel checked his watch, satisfied, and reached for his pen. He had no idea the meeting he thought he controlled was already over. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. 9 years earlier, Victoria Worrell had nothing but a laptop, a folding table, and a conviction nobody else could see the shape of yet. She rented a single room above a print shop in a part of the city investors never bothered driving through, and she filled it with 3 people who believed her when she said the technology they were building would matter. She worked past midnight, more nights than she slept a full 8 hours, not because someone told her to, but because she had watched too many good ideas die from being managed carefully instead of pushed hard. Discipline was the thing people noticed about her first. The vision came later, once they understood what the discipline was for. She built Vantage Horizon Technologies the way a person builds something they intend to still be standing in 50 years. Slowly where it mattered, fast where it counted, and always with her name attached to the parts that could fail. By the time the company had outgrown its third office, the industry had stopped treating her like a curiosity and started treating her like a threat, which she considered the more honest of the two reactions. She turned artificial intelligence research into cybersecurity infrastructure that governments and Fortune 500 companies quietly depended on, and she did it as one of the only Black women in the country running a company at that scale. She never made a performance of that fact. She let the balance sheets do the talking, and the balance sheets said, Vantage Horizon was no longer a startup. It was an institution with her fingerprints on every decision that had made it one. By the time she was in her early 40s, Victoria had stopped walking into rooms and started changing them. She had a way of sitting still, while everyone else in a negotiation talked themselves into a worse position, and a way of asking one quiet question that ended arguments other executives had been having for weeks. People who worked for her either loved her completely or found the pace unbearable. There wasn't much room in between. The employees who stayed did so because she remembered their names, their kids' names, and the small promises she'd made them 2 years earlier, and kept every one. She had built something rare in her industry, a company where the vision at the top hadn't been diluted by a single boardroom compromise. That, more than the revenue, was what she was proudest of. It was also, though she didn't know it yet, the exact thing certain people around her had started to resent. The morning the merger was announced, the building felt different before anyone said a word. Someone had brought in coffee from the good place 3 blocks over instead of the machine in the break room, which was how the staff had learned over the years to recognize when leadership was about to say something big. Victoria stood at the front of the all-hands meeting in the atrium, glass walls on 3 sides, the city spread out behind her like something she had personally arranged, and she told 900 employees that Vantage Horizon Technologies was merging with Sterling Crest Capital in a deal worth $950 million. The room did not just clap, it roared. People who had joined the company when it was 40 employees in a rented floor hugged people who had joined 6 months ago and only knew Vantage Horizon as the place that had turned down 3 acquisition offers because Victoria said the timing wasn't right. This time the timing was right, and everyone in that atrium understood they were about to be part of something that would be written about for years. New departments, new funding, thousands of new jobs, and a founder who was about to become one of the most recognized names in the industry, a Black woman who had built something this large without asking anyone's permission to do it. Investors called it the deal of the decade. Financial press ran her photo beside the merger figure before the ink was even close to dry. Sterling Crest's team flew in for a celebratory dinner where champagne came out before the appetizers, and one of their senior partners stood to make a toast that mentioned legacy, vision, and the future of American technology in the same 3 sentences. Victoria smiled through all of it, shook every hand that was offered, and let herself believe, for the first time in 9 years, that she had reached the part of the story where things simply got to be good. She had built something that worked. Soon it would be protected by more capital and more infrastructure than she could have managed alone. Her dream, as far as she could tell that night, was complete. It was only in the weeks that followed that small things started arriving out of order. A financial report that used to land on her desk by Tuesday didn't show up until Thursday, with an apology about system delays that didn't quite explain itself. A strategy meeting about the transition timeline had already happened by the time someone remembered to loop her in, and when she asked why, the answer was something about scheduling conflicts that nobody repeated the same way twice. None of it was dramatic enough to raise on its own. All of it, together, would have looked like something if she had been looking for it yet. She wasn't. She had spent 9 years training herself to trust results over politics, and the results, on paper, had never been better. Daniel Whitaker had been there since the beginning, in the sense that mattered most to her. Not since the founding exactly, but since the moment 18 months in, when Victoria realized she couldn't keep running finance and operations and product development with 3 overworked people and a spreadsheet. She had hired him as her first real executive, back when the company could barely afford his salary, because he was the only candidate in a dozen interviews who challenged her numbers instead of complimenting her vision. She liked that about him immediately. He became her chief operating officer 2 years later, and, for a long stretch after that, the person she trusted most to tell her the truth when everyone else in the room had learned to simply agree with her. They had built parts of the company together in a way that felt, from the outside, like partnership. Late nights closing early contracts, arguments over hiring decisions that both of them still brought up as jokes years later, the kind of history that made people assume they finished each other's sentences in board meetings. For a long time, they did. Victoria trusted him the way she trusted very few people, which was completely, and without asking what he wanted for himself, once the company outgrew needing the two of them equally. What she didn't see, because she had never had a reason to look for it, was the exact moment his loyalty started competing with his ambition instead of serving hers. It hadn't happened all at once. It had happened the way most quiet betrayals do. A comment here about how the board might want more balanced leadership once the merger closed. A private lunch with an investor that he never mentioned afterward. A growing habit of finalizing decisions in conversations Victoria was told about instead of included in. Individually, each one had an explanation. Worrell, Daniel had always been good at explanations. Together, they were the outline of a plan that had already been drawn, one meeting at a time, while Victoria was busy believing that loyalty, once earned, didn't need to be checked on. She noticed the distance before she understood it. Executives who used to stop by her office just to think out loud started scheduling time instead. Questions in leadership meetings that used to come to her directly started going to Daniel first, as though he had quietly become the room's real center of gravity without anyone voting on it. She raised it once, lightly, over coffee with him, and he laughed it off with an answer that made sense at the time. Everyone was stretched thin with the merger prep. Tensions were high. It would settle once the deal closed. She believed him, because believing him had never once cost her anything before. The message that changed all of it arrived on a Tuesday morning at 8:47, in a Slack channel that had nothing to do with her. Someone on the legal integration team had meant to send it to a private thread with 2 other names on it, and had instead hit a channel Victoria happened to be a member of, from an old project nobody had bothered removing her from. She almost didn't see it. She was scrolling past notifications on her way into a meeting when her own name stopped her thumb. Once the merger is signed, legal will finalize Victoria's removal. Everything is already approved. She read it twice, standing perfectly still in a hallway full of people who had no idea what had just landed in her hand. Then she read it a 3rd time, because some part of her was waiting for the sentence to rearrange itself into something less specific. Something she could still explain away, the way she'd explained away everything else for the last 6 weeks. It didn't rearrange itself. 4 words in particular refused to soften, no matter how many times she looked at them. Everything is already approved. Not proposed, not discussed. Approved. Which meant this had a timeline, a paper trail, and people who had signed off on it, long before anyone thought to warn her. Victoria did not raise her voice. She did not confront anyone in the hallway, or storm into Daniel's office, or do any of the things a person is allowed to do when they discover the people closest to them have been planning to erase them. She put her phone in her pocket, walked into the meeting she had been heading toward, and sat through 40 minutes of merger logistics without a single person at the table, guessing that she now knew more about her own company's future than most of them did. It was, she would think later, the most disciplined hour of her career. It was also the moment she stopped being the CEO who trusted first and asked questions later, and became someone else entirely, someone who intended to find out exactly how far this went before she let anyone see that she knew. She started that same afternoon, quietly, the way she did everything that mattered. She didn't call a lawyer from the building's directory or loop in HR because she had no way of knowing yet who on that list already had a hand in what she'd just read. Instead, she called Marcus Reed at home that evening, a lawyer she had worked with years before Vantage Horizon existed, someone whose loyalty had never once been tied to her title. She told him what the message said and asked him one question: could he look at the merger documents, quietly, without anyone at the company knowing he was looking? What Marcus found over the next 10 days took the shape of something far larger than one careless message. Buried in an amended section of the merger agreement, language that had been added after Victoria's own legal review, in a version that had circulated only among a handful of people, was a clause restructuring the voting rights attached to her founder shares once the deal closed. On paper, it read like standard post-merger governance housekeeping. In practice, it moved control of the company's direction almost entirely into the hands of the new combined board, with Victoria retaining a title and very little else. She had read every version of that agreement herself. This clause had not been in any draft she'd approved. Elena Brooks, a financial analyst Victoria trusted enough to bring in on the quiet, found the second piece, almost by accident, while cross-checking the numbers. Sterling Crest's investors had been shown against Vantage Horizon's actual internal reporting. The figures didn't match. Certain performance projections had been adjusted upward in the version given to outside investors, while the version that had gone to Victoria weeks earlier told a more modest, more accurate story. Someone had built two different pictures of the same company and made sure only one of them reached the people writing the check. The last piece was the hardest to look at, because it wasn't hidden in a document at all. It was in a pattern of meetings, quiet conversations between Daniel and 3 members of the board, spaced out over months, none of them large enough on their own to draw attention. All of them pointed in the same direction. Victoria didn't need someone to hand her a transcript to understand what those meetings had been about. She understood it the way she understood most things about her own company, by noticing what didn't add up and refusing to look away from it once she had. By the time Marcus laid it all out for her, across a small table in his home office, late enough at night that neither of them had bothered turning on more than one lamp, Victoria understood the shape of what she was facing. This wasn't a single betrayal from one ambitious executive. It was a plan, built carefully over months, with enough people involved that removing her had started to look, to the people planning it, like a foregone conclusion rather than a decision anyone still needed to make. They believed the paperwork was airtight. They believed she would sign what was put in front of her, the way she always had, because she had spent 9 years training herself to trust the people she'd built the company with. Victoria sat with that for a long moment before she said anything at all. Then she looked at Marcus and asked him to keep everything they'd found in one place, quietly, and to start preparing it the way a person prepares something they intend to use only once, at exactly the right moment. She had built Vantage Horizon Technologies out of nothing once already. She did not intend to hand it to anyone who thought a hidden clause and a few private conversations were enough to take it from her a second time. The investigation stopped being quiet the day Sophia Grant walked into Marcus Reed's home office and set her phone face down on the table before she said a word. Sophia ran employee relations for Vantage Horizon, which meant she was usually the person other people came to when something felt wrong before they could prove it did. For weeks, she had been fielding a strange pattern of conversations. A data engineer who'd been told to stop asking questions about a reporting discrepancy until after the transition, a finance associate who'd been quietly moved off a project the day she flagged a number that didn't reconcile, a director who'd been reminded, almost gently, that loyalty during a transition like this one would be remembered. None of it had been a direct threat. all of it had been designed not to look like one. She had come to Marcus because Victoria had asked her to look for exactly this, and because what she'd found was worse than either of them had expected. It wasn't only documents that had been altered. It was people who had noticed something true and been talked out of saying it, one careful conversation at a time. Sophia had 3 names willing to speak on the record if it mattered, and a 4th, who wanted to, but was still deciding whether being right was worth the risk. Victoria listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Sophia finished, she thanked her the way she thanked people for hard truths. Plainly, without performance, already thinking about what came next. Elena Brooks finished her own piece 2 days later. She laid the 2 versions of Vantage Horizon's financial projections side by side on the table, the one Victoria had reviewed, and the one that had gone out to Sterling Crest's investment committee, and the gap between them was not a rounding error or an optimistic forecast. It was a different set of numbers, built to tell a more flattering story to the people writing a $950 million check. Someone had signed off on sending it. Elena had the internal file history to prove exactly who. By the time all 3 of them, Marcus with the merger clauses, Elena with the falsified figures, Sophia with the quiet intimidation of anyone who noticed either one, sat across from Victoria with everything laid out, there was no reasonable explanation left standing. This had not been a single executive's overreach. It had been a plan, with enough moving parts, that stopping it would require more than a private conversation. It would require doing it in a room no one could later claim hadn't happened. The signing was 11 days away, when Victoria decided exactly where and when. Not in Daniel's office, where the conversation could be reframed the moment she left the room. Not in a private meeting with the board, where 3 votes had already been quietly secured against her. It would have to happen in front of everyone at once. The board, the investors, the executives who believed the outcome was already settled, because a plan built on private conversations only survives as long as it stays private. In the days that followed, Daniel Whitaker grew more relaxed, not less. He had started referring to the post-merger transition in the past tense in meetings, as though it had already happened, and twice, Victoria overheard him discussing office assignments for the new combined leadership team without her name attached to any of them. He wasn't hiding it particularly well anymore, because he had stopped believing he needed to. The board members who'd aligned with him had grown comfortable too, trading small jokes in the hallway about how smoothly this had all come together, how little resistance there had been. They believed the hardest part was behind them. Victoria let them believe it. Every ounce of their confidence was information she could use, and she intended to use every bit of it. She spent those 11 days doing 2 things at once: running the company exactly as she always had, so nothing about her behavior would give away what she knew, and building, with Marcus, Elena, and Sophia, a single document that laid out the entire structure of what had been done to her, in an order designed to be undeniable the moment it was seen. The Slack message that had started it, the hidden clause rewriting her voting power, the 2 sets of financial projections, the names of the employees who had been quietly pressured into silence, several of whom had agreed to have their accounts included. Once they understood, Victoria already knew enough to protect them. It was not evidence built to win an argument. It was evidence built so that no argument would be necessary. The morning of the signing arrived exactly the way the opening of this story already told you it would. Victoria walked into the boardroom 11 minutes before 9, sat through Daniel's parting comment about vision and machines, let the room laugh at it, and sent Marcus the one line she'd promised him under the table. What that morning didn't show was what came after the waiting. At 2 minutes to the hour, as Sterling Crest's lead partner reached for the signing folder, Victoria spoke before he could open it. She did not raise her voice. She had decided days earlier that she wouldn't need to. She told the room, calmly, that before anyone signed anything, there was something everyone at this table deserved to see. Then she nodded, and Marcus stepped in with the folder he'd been holding for 11 days, and the room's easy morning confidence started, very quietly, to come apart. She began with the message. She read it exactly as it had arrived, word for word. The sentence that had first told her legal was already finalizing her removal before anyone had asked her opinion on it. She watched several faces around the table go still in a way that had nothing to do with surprise at the content, and everything to do with surprise that she had it at all. Then she laid out the second piece, internal messages showing Daniel had spent months coordinating her replacement, with members sitting in that very room, conversations he had never once mentioned to her directly. Daniel's easy posture didn't move, but something behind his eyes did, the particular stillness of a man recalculating in real time. The third revelation was Elena's. 2 sets of financial projections, side by side, the real numbers and the version that had gone to the people now sitting across the table, with their signing pens still in hand. Sterling Crest's partner went very quiet reading it. The kind of quiet that belongs to a person realizing they had almost paid $950 million for a company that wasn't quite the one they'd been shown. The fourth piece was the clause itself, the language buried in an amended section that would have moved Victoria's control into hands that were never supposed to have it, flagged now, in front of the very lawyers who had let it through. Victoria let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she said the only thing left worth saying, that the people at this table had believed removing her would make the company safer, when the truth was that removing accountability was the only thing that had ever put it at risk. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Every document already on the table had said the rest for her. Sterling Crest's team asked for a recess before Victoria had finished setting the folder down. What happened over the next hour happened mostly without her, which was exactly how she wanted it. Investors reviewing the evidence in a side room, calling their own counsel, asking questions of board members who no longer had a coordinated answer to give. By early afternoon, Sterling Crest's lead partner delivered the decision himself, in front of the same table where the deal had almost been signed that morning. The merger was off. $950 million, gone in the space of a single meeting, not because Victoria had failed to deliver a company worth investing in, but because the version of that company someone had shown them had never actually existed. The camera crews still waiting in the lobby had come to film a signing. By evening, they had a very different story, and it led every business page in the country, not the record close of a merger, but its collapse, and the founder who had walked in with the proof to stop it. What came apart after that came apart quickly. 2 board members who had helped move the hidden clause resigned within the week, rather than face a formal inquiry. A third was removed outright, once the falsified projections were traced back to an email he'd personally approved. Daniel Whitaker's departure was the least complicated decision the board had to make all year. There was no argument left in his favor once the record was laid out in full, and even the executives who had quietly gone along with the plan out of loyalty to him found there was very little loyalty left to offer once his name stopped being useful to attach themselves to. The junior board liaison who had tried, 11 days earlier, to ask an honest question about the governance clause before Daniel talked over him, was the first person Victoria called that evening, not to apologize, but to ask him to help lead the new review process the company would need going forward. He said yes before she finished the sentence. It took months, not days, for Vantage Horizon to feel like itself again. Victoria didn't rush it. She met individually with the employees who had been pressured into silence, thanked each of them by name for the risk they'd taken once they finally spoke, and made sure every one of them understood that nothing about their position would be affected by the truth they'd told. Even the one who had spent weeks deciding whether being right was worth the risk came forward 2 days after the collapse, once she saw exactly what had happened to the people who'd already told the truth. Nothing, except that they were finally believed. Victoria brought in outside governance experts to rebuild the parts of the company that had made this possible in the first place. New protections requiring any change to executive voting structures to go through independent review. A direct channel for employees to raise concerns without a manager standing between them and the truth. Quarterly financial disclosures, reviewed by someone with no stake in how flattering the numbers looked. She kept the small framed photo from the credenza, the one from the folding table in the rented office, and had it moved to her own desk instead, where she could see it every day, instead of only on the mornings she happened to glance at it. It reminded her of something she hadn't fully understood back when this all began, that building something worth protecting, and actually protecting it, were two different disciplines, and she had spent 9 years mastering only the first one. A year after the merger that never happened, Vantage Horizon Technologies was worth more than it had been the morning Sterling Crest's team walked in with their signing folder, not because the company had grown around a bigger deal, but because it had grown around a founder who had finally learned to watch for the threats that don't announce themselves. She still trusted people. She simply no longer confused trust with the absence of vigilance, and she made sure the company she'd built would never again depend entirely on one person's ability to tell the difference. Victoria Worrell had built a company once, by believing that results would always protect her. She rebuilt it by understanding that no result is safe without someone willing to keep watching after it's achieved, and this time, she made certain that person would never again be her alone.